I tried to research this Google Classroom platform, and I don't see here a video option. I don't know how to do that.
I think something's in the new Hangouts. I think Google Hangouts supposedly has.
Well, that's another, yeah, but it's more like kind of chatting platform. But Google Classroom is specifically for educational projects, but I'm not sure if it allows for real video connection.
You have to attach them through links for video collection, or through uploading a slideshow or something like that.
Okay.
You'll have to load it from your drive.
I see. But there is no like direct broadcast to the web.
It's something that I've read they're planning on beginning on August the 1st
Okay.
as an update, since so many schools are still having to teach online. I know I will start teaching online again on August the 3rd.
Okay.
Well,
Anyway,
you may have to be, Terrace, like one of the like these game streamers and run open broadcast studio or something like that, and then you have
yeah, I do have. I actually installed one program like that, and it's a little bit too complicated, I think, for everyone to use. I'm just you know, afraid that some people will have to, because it actually needs something to be installed and then to connect to the server and so on.
Right.
But that would be cool to use that. Okay, so we can start. Can you see my screen now, the presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so today we are speaking about Psalm 2. And as always, I put a little title here. It's just my, my feeling about this psalm. What is the central theme of that? Is the anointed Son of God. And every word here is very important. And in the course of our looking at the psalm today, I will explain more about this. Let's first, as always, read the psalm. Have you had the chance to read it at home?
Yes.
Is that kind of clear text, or is it complicated and obscure?
I read it from two different Bibles, and it was pretty clear with one of them, but with the other it was not. I ended up getting more context clues from actually pulling a Bible written in Latin and translating it myself.
Okay, so that needs an expert knowledge, requires an expert knowledge of Latin. Okay, good. Let me try to read it here in this translation I'm using from the Septuagint. It's a little bit kind of old-fashioned language, but still. Okay, Psalm 2, a Psalm of David. Why have the heathen raged, and the peoples meditated empty things?
We're not seeing the PowerPoint.
Okay.
I'm not.
Somehow, yeah, I see.
I'm not seeing it at all.
Let me double. There is something today with the. You are seeing YouTube screen. Huh, okay, curious. Okay. Now?
Yes. Now.
Yes, now it's fine.
No, it's fine. Okay.
Yes.
So sorry for that. So I started that with the claim that for me this is a psalm about the anointed Son of God. We will explain that later. And now let's start reading the psalm. So a psalm of David. Why have the heathen raged and the peoples meditated empty things? The kings of the earth were aroused, and the rulers were assembled together against the Lord and against his Christ. Or the reading could be against his anointed one. Let us break their bonds asunder, and let us cast away their yoke from us. He that dwells in the heavens shall laugh them to scorn, and the Lord shall deride them. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath, and in his anger shall he trouble them. But as for me, I was established as king by him upon Zion, his holy mountain, proclaiming the decree of the Lord. The Lord said unto me, Thou art my son, today thee. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt hurt them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt shatter them like a potter's vessel. And now, O you kings, understand, be instructed, all you that judge the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice in him with trembling. Lay hold of instruction, lest at any time the Lord be angry and you perish from the righteous way. When quickly his wrath is kindled, blessed are all that have put their trust in him. Sorry, I'm stumbling with this text. It's a little bit, old-fashioned and complicated. But it certainly looks rather obscure from the first sight. Honestly, I have heard that psalm many times in the church and read myself, but when I started to work with translation, with biblical commentaries, I was like, wow, I never noticed that. What is that? I was like really surprised with different nuances of meaning. So I will try to share with you today what I discovered for myself. Okay, so it's... forgot to translate this part. It says Psalm 2 as introduction to the Psalter, because as I mentioned before, Psalm 1 is like really a foreword to the whole Psalter. It doesn't, in a way, it doesn't belong to the number of Psalms, really. It's more like a little prelude to the Psalter, whereas Psalm 2 is the first real psalm, so to speak. And why I'm saying that? Because as we mentioned already, Psalm 1 has a very strange form. It doesn't mention God once. It's not directed towards God. It doesn't address God in any form. It doesn't have a form of prayer or hymn or anything. So it's simply kind of pious instruction at the beginning of the Psalter. And also it's not subscribed with the name of David, whereas Psalm 1 is the first from the whole series of Psalms having David's name. But we will come to that in the due time. So what is important to remember is that Psalms 1 and 2 have some close connection, because Psalm 1 is introducing the Psalter generally, and Psalm 2 is the first of the line of many Psalms. This connection between them is like subtly manifested on different literary levels. For example, the Psalm 1 starts, "Blessed is the man," and Psalm 2 ends, "Blessed are blessed are those that have put their trust in him." So there is this blessedness that starts Psalm 1 and blessedness at the end of the Psalm 2. Another common theme is the way. So something we talked about a lot in our treatment of Psalm 1, the way of the righteous contrasted with the way of the sinners, and this way is not so prominently featured in Psalm 2, but it's mentioned. So like the warning, so don't fight God, don't fight the Lord, because you might get lost from the righteous way. So if you oppose God, you lose your way of life, basically. So these two psalms together form a single unified introduction to the Psalter. First is Wisdom Psalm that contains instructions for young prince, perhaps Solomon, if we take seriously Davidic authorship of first, like first 20 or so Psalms, maybe. We haven't, that's completely hypothetical. And the second Psalm is coronation Psalm. That is clearly written for the inauguration of the new king and contains the promise of divine protection for the newly appointed king. So it's these two can be related in this sense that first is instruction for the future king, and the second psalm is the coronation psalm, even the coronation ceremony, as we will see later, for the actual king. Also, as I mentioned already, Psalm 2 is the first among the so-called David Psalms. So psalms that bear the name of David. And I have showed this table already, but just to remind you, there are different names of people mentioned as authors of psalms, but David, of course, is the most prominent of them. And there is a big number, the biggest of all, psalms associated directly with David's name. And as you can see here, they are unevenly distributed among different parts of the Psalter. There are 37 psalms in the first book, 18 in the second, and then again 15 in the fifth part. As I also mentioned, this association with the name of David doesn't mean necessarily the authorship in our modern sense of the word, that he actually composed them or even less wrote them physically. It simply means that these psalms have to do with David somehow. They are written by David, composed by David, inspired by David's example, dedicated to David. There might be different interpretations of this attribution. Anyway, what is historical context of this psalm? I mentioned at the beginning that it's also always useful to ask, why was this psalm written? For what purpose was... Sorry, I forgot to turn on video. I'm sorry. Why was this psalm written? For what purpose? In what context? For what exactly use? And so on. And Psalm 2 is probably, with big probability, high probability, it was used as a coronation ritual, as a coronation hymn during the coronation ceremony, or perhaps was inspired by the memory of the coronation ceremony. There is no way of knowing that, whether it was actually used in the moment of coronation of great kings of Israel in the time of David, Solomon, or their their heirs, or was it written later just as a memory of this idealized great coronations? We don't know that. But what is important for us to start with is that in order to appreciate this psalm, we have to look at the meaning, significance kings had in the New Testament. Because for us, modern people, obviously kings are not sacred figures, unless we are British. But normally we all got rid of monarchy, and it's certainly not viewed with a lot of religious piety or any religious connotations. But in the ancient world, everywhere, not only in Israel, but in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, all over Near East, and even beyond the Near East, royal figures have always been surrounded by this kind of divine status, divine reputation. They were considered to be human, usually. Sometimes they were considered to be divine even. But even when they were considered human, they were still like mediators between God and ordinary human beings. So they were never ordinary human beings. Of course, in the Old Testament, with its emphasis on monotheism, so professing one God, king was never divinized, was never really considered to be like God or semi-God, but still he was an important central religious and political figure. This is something they call today theocracy. So the figure that is in charge of political life, economic life, military life is at the same time a sacred figure that has specific liturgical and more broadly religious functions. And kings of ancient Israel were exactly this. If we look at all like standard introductions to the Old Testament theology, they will always say that there are like 4 pillars of the Old Testament religiosity and Old Testament faith, religion. Land of Israel, the promised land, the Holy Land, was given by God, promised by God, and then given by God for the people to inhabit. And so land was not simply seen as a geographical phenomenon or commodity or anything. It was sacred. It was something that was given by God, received from God, and was actually defining the identity of Israel as God's chosen people. Another thing that was central to the religious identity of Israel was Jerusalem as a capital, and especially the temple in the center, in the heart of Jerusalem, on the Holy Mount of Zion. But it was not only the temple of Jerusalem that was there and was the presence of God, the place of God's abode, but also the royal palace was on Zion, and the king was the religiously important, religiously meaningful figure that kind of embodied in himself divine sonship that was given to the whole people. We will come to that quotation later, but in the book of Exodus, the whole nation of Israel, people of Israel are called the son of God in singular, meaning that it's kind of collective sonship, not many sons of God, but Israel as the son of God. And king was a son of God in the first place. He was like the embodiment, concretization of this collective sonship in one sacred figure. And as such, he was ruling the people, and he was also participating in his own way in liturgical services of the first temple. And then the fourth component, the law. So the written law, the book, the Torah, but also law as practice of life, as a way of religious living. So these 4 components, and king is among them. So king as a sacred cultic figure, he's a representative of God for the people. Sometimes some biblical scholars refer to Israel's notion of royalty, of kingship, as lesser Yahweh. So Yahweh is this sacred, mysterious name of God in the Old Testament. And of course, God is God, someone who revealed himself to Israel, and with some degree of approximation, we can speak about king as the lesser God, so the God's representative. And it sounds very daring to say that. Of course, it's not, again, it's not to undermine the monotheistic spirit of Israelite religion. It's simply to emphasize that this monotheism did not function as present-day monotheistic religions like Islam or Christianity or Judaism. It had a very specific Near Eastern ancient character in which king had played a great role. Just to give you one example from Psalm 109, which is another very important royal psalm, and you can also at home later read it for yourself and compare Psalm 2 and Psalm 109, which are kind of similar in character because they come from the same royal cult. So the psalm starts in this way. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies the footstool of thy feet. Have you ever heard this quotation? The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies the footstool of your feet. Or sometimes they translate, until I place your enemies at your feet. Where do you know this quote from?
Gospel.
Yes, it's mentioned in the gospel. And there it's also played with the ambiguity of this. What does it mean? So the Lord said to my Lord. So the Lord said, well, it's a commonplace in biblical text because many prophetic texts and so on start with the sentence, Lord.
Looks like you froze up, Timo.
Yeah. We can't hear you anymore.
Yes, frozen for me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, all frozen.
Unless he's really just concentrating to make his next thought.
Yeah, something happened.
The joy of live interaction.
Oh, yeah.
Еще не лекции не робила.
Mm-mm.
Looks like you dropped and reconnecting. Good.
Sorry, my internet connection disappeared.
That's fine. It happens to all of us sometimes.
Yeah, I apologize. Let me share the screen again. So when Jesus is asked about, well, let's not go into that. It's New Testament. We will not touch it. But anyway, so it's here in the historical context of the psalm, it means basically that the Lord is speaking to the king and promises to the king his support and that he will defeat all his enemies under his feet. So it means that in the religious conscience of ancient Israel, this viewing king as a second god, so to speak, was pretty normal, pretty generally accepted. And it was certainly accepted all over Near East with the pagan nations. And so here we have a curious, in this psalm, we have a curious combination of traditional Near Eastern imagery that has to do with royal cults and the place of royalty in the society and in religion, and specifically Israelite monotheistic religious awareness. Let's look more closely how it functions. So very important is also in the context of Old Testament royalty to look at the Davidic dynasty. The Davidic dynasty is the central messianic reality of the Old Testament, because the coming of the Messiah was announced and pronounced and promised many times, starting with Genesis 3 through Noah, Abraham, and so on. But it was never very clearly defined how Messiah will be born and from what lineage he will come until David. Well, Abraham was given the same promise and so on, obviously, but David, as the founder of royal dynasty, was given this explicit promise that from his lineage, from his dynasty, the Messiah will be born. And so it's recorded in the second book of Samuel, chapter 7. And so in the culture of Israel of that time, royalty, and certainly in the holy texts of different biblical books and Psalms in particular, royalty as political leadership and royalty as messianic promise, something from which the Messiah will emerge, are actually blended together, that you can never separate. Whenever Psalms speak of kings or king, they usually speak also of the Messiah. And there is a very interesting linguistic side to that. We will look at that a little bit further down. So just to summarize, here we have in this psalm, we have a royal inauguration rite, anointed with the holy oil, coronation, and enthronement, presented in a poetic way. Some biblical scholars and historians of the Near East worked to actually represent a whole structure of inauguration, royal inauguration ceremony, and they collected different texts throughout the Bible, the Old Testament obviously, to show which parts did this ceremony include, how did it look. So, and they emphasize 6 parts or 6 stages of someone becoming the king. The first was that the future king, the candidate for kingship, the prince comes to the temple and stands on a high place in the middle of the temple. So that's how the ceremony starts. And it's described in the respective texts here, 2 Kings and so on. Then the high priest gives him royal insignia, scapeter, so this kind of decorated rod, stick, mantle, crown, places crown on his head, and gives him a scroll. I will explain later what this scroll is. All these components of the ceremony are well known to us from other Near Eastern sources. I will just show you a couple of illustrations from some Babylonian, Mesopotamian art. So like this one. It's a representation of a king that has a rod, a large stick, and a scepter, a kind of symbolic presentation of power. Switch to some other photographs. Yeah. Okay.